The hard-working people of law enforcement often have very challenging work indeed, as they face horrors that you might never expect. It's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. Number 1. When I asked my father to tell me some of the worst things he'd ever experienced in the police force, I never actually expected to hear the gnarliest story I had ever heard. He was often the first officer on the scene after a death was reported. Many of these cases were old people who had heart attacks or suffered similar, relatively bland fates by comparison. But every now and again, he'd get called out to help deal with people who had fallen asleep in the bath and remained submerged for days, sometimes weeks. He told us about the man who had one of those heating elements that kept your bath warm. He slowly cooked for 2 weeks before his daughter found him in what was essentially a human crock pot without the lid. That was bad. The other story is worse. He was called out with his colleague to help deal with an old man who had come home from the pub, had a stroke, and died. He had laid down in front of their electric fireplace before the event. And here's where things get super freaky. His wife, who by this point was very far gone with Alzheimer's disease, had brought him a huge collection of toast, crumpets, beans on toast, and numerous cups of tea, and had laid them around her husband over the course of 2 weeks. My dad said she had zero comprehension of anything they had said to her. She either referred to the old man as her boyfriend, their strange guest, or the gas man, and they had been married for 40 years. When my old man and his colleagues proceeded to remove the corpse, he said it took them ages, as the meat was so tender that it slipped off the bone of whatever part of the body they lifted off the ground. The smell was apparently unfathomable, and no human should ever look the way the old man did. I never knew half of the shit my dad experienced in the police, but I guess it sort of explains his bitterness and the fact that he can be an arse piece. My girlfriend still wants to study forensic science, which looks cool as hell, but I would never do anything like that after hearing his tales. Super gnarly. Number 2. My roommate is a first responder. A few years back, the local Indian reservation was having a bit of trouble with a crack cocaine problem. Everyone knew who the big drug dealer was, but the RCMP's hands were tied due to the jurisdiction issues with the tribal police. Now, the tribal police had their own issues with corruption, case in point, and a convicted paedophile acting as a tribal police officer. Well, it seems that no one in law enforcement wanted to try and take this dealer down, so some of the tribal members decided to pursue justice in their own way. Anyhow, my roommate was working emergency services the night in question, and is dispatched to this dealer's house on the reservation. When he and his partner arrive, the house is surrounded by cops, guns drawn, and my roommate has to wait to enter until the property has been cleared. Finally, They get word that there are 2 casualties inside, probably both dead, but need to be checked out by paramedics before they can call the coroner's office. So my roommate grabs his bag and walks in. There, in a darkened living room, lit only by the TV, which is still on, he sees the dealer sitting in his easy chair, face up and remote in hand. His entire face is gone. He had taken multiple gunshots to the face and head. He knew it was futile, but he checks for a pulse, and of course there is none. But the cops then beckon him into another room, where the dealer's underage girlfriend is on the floor. She had been shot so many times in the torso that the only thing keeping her body together was her spinal column. My roommate didn't have to check to know she was very, very dead, and just told the cops to go ahead and call in the coroner. Now, he's seen a lot of messed up shit in his line of work, but he said the thing that he found the most creepy about the whole situation was the dude just sitting there watching TV with his face blown off. Laugh tracks going on in the background from whatever show he had on. He said it was something out of a horror movie. I don't think they ever arrested anyone for the murders, but I'm pretty sure they all knew who was involved in getting rid of their drug lord. Number 3. I'm not a cop, but I know a lot about the case and know someone personally who discovered it. In my city, at the travel lodge on the main commercial street, a few people who met on some dating site or Craigslist, something, ended up ritually killing themselves inside one of the rooms. According to the police, the 2 people who found it weren't the actual cops, but rather the next-door occupants. They heard a commotion and looked out their door, only to find blood coming through the door like it was out of The Shining. They walked in to investigate and found the mangled bodies of the 2 women who found each other and the barely living body of the guy who found them both. As he told it, they were supposed to let him kill them both for the glory of Satan or some shit like that. Then he would kill himself. The crime scene was so gruesome and traumatic that several police officers and paramedics and nurses who treated the guy were all later treated for post-traumatic stress, and the incident has led the way for a movement calling for having PTSD therapy for first responders. Another case I know about is when I was in cadets for a few years a while back, and the commanding officer of our air sister corps was caught with child pornography. This guy was a major, and he was in charge of around about 100 children on a weekly basis. I was told he later hung himself in order to escape prosecution. Funny story, I was on a field trip and our bus driver wore a bomber jacket with the Royal Canadian Air Cadet Crest Corps on it. I sparked up a conversation with him, and as it turns out, he was a major and was the pedo's direct successor. One thing led to another, and we got on the conversation about the major pedophile and how the corps reacted. Believe it or not, but as it turns out, taking over the Air Cadet Corps for someone like that isn't as hard as one would expect, apparently. The cop who found it, coincidentally, the mother of one of the air cadets in the corps, called it the most disgusting thing she had seen in all her years of service. Safe to say it, but my town of just under 200,000 people is quite the little screw-up. Mind you, I haven't even mentioned it being the meth and crack and heroin per capita capital of Ontario. That's a whole nother story. Number 4. So, we get a call to do a welfare check. Someone called the station house because they hadn't heard from their mum and asked if we could pretty please swing by to check in on her. We get to the apartment building, knock on the door, and when there is inevitably no answer, we grab the super to open the door for us. The first sign that things are going terribly wrong was that the chain was still on the door. The second was the god-awful stench coming from the place that told us that there was something very dead inside. As before, it's dark in there, and none of the lights worked because they had burnt out in the time the poor lady had been sitting there. We found her on the couch, positive Q sign, which is hanging your tongue out of your mouth like you're dead, and the smell of the beginning stages of decomposition. So, it's the DOA, the cops in the living room, and the super standing in the doorway of this dark apartment, and we obviously have our flashlights trained on the guest of honor. At this point, the dead person raises a hand to her eyes in a very zombie-like fashion and says, "Nya," exactly like that. So totally zombie, right? Having seen enough of this, we, again, run out of there like we've seen a ghost. The super, who's not privy to the rise of the dead, sees 2 3'6" cops thundering down the hallway at him and figures this was his cue to get moving too. Sadly, we overtake him and his stubby little legs and leave him to be dinned up by the zombie. Survival of the fittest and all right. We got down to the next flight before we figured out that even if it was a zombie, it was an old lady one, and we could probably kick its ass. We went back to the apartment and called an ambulance for her. She apparently had a stroke alone in the apartment and sat there for a few days. The hand and vocalizations were really all that was left of her brain responding to stimulus. We went by the hospital the next few days before work, but she was too far gone. Number 5. I once went to a house where the tenant had not been seen in a while. It was around about midnight, on a very rough council estate by myself, on a night, but I was supposed to be finished by 11 p.m. I circle the building on this cold, dark and windy night, and I couldn't see any lights on. So, I push the letterbox open just to peep and see if I can peek inside. However, I can't see anything at all, and I couldn't smell anything either. And I could hear a faint, dripping noise. There was also no response when knocking, so I smashed the door in, and the smell hit me like a ton of bricks. I took one step in, and luckily looked down and saw a mesh of hair by my foot. The guy was there on the floor. He'd been there for at least the last 4 months. His face was now a feature on the carpet, and his arm had been forced from his body by his own weight. He was wearing a pink thong and nothing else, and had fallen out of the bathroom, the longest 3-hour wait ever, for someone to take over from me so that I could write up my notes. However, that is not as bad as when my colleague did the same thing, going in through a bathroom window, and ended up putting her foot through the head of the deceased, and she was walking around unable to find the light switch. Brain matter all over her trousers. Number 6. I am a security officer in a casino, and you wouldn't believe the random shit that you see in one of these places. This happened around about 6 months ago. We got a call from someone overdosing in one of the hotel rooms. A few of our EMTs were dispatched, and about 5 of us security officers were dispatched to the call in reference to suspects from the room fleeing the scene of the crime. So the EMTs get up to the room and a guy answers the door. He so happened to be the victim's boyfriend. He stated that his girlfriend was on the bed, naked, packed with ice, and he books it out of the room along with her best friend, her boyfriend, and 2 others. The EMT enters the room and starts working on the girl. Meanwhile, myself and the 4 other officers hop in the mobility units to find the fleeing subjects. 4 of them decide to book it on foot over our levee, and they were stopped. Myself and another guy cut through one of our parking lots and stop the boyfriend. We finally get him cuffed and in a vehicle, and we drive him over to the police, who were already with the 4 others. Turns out the boyfriend was a neo-Nazi who had a few teardrop tats and the SS emblem on his forearm, along with the swastika, a spider web tattoo, which is a prison tattoo, all over his body. The police search the guy and don't find a thing, as we did also. They find a Bowie knife, a stiletto, and some other fixed blades that he had in his backpack, along with 2 loaded handguns with around 150 rounds of ammunition. Meanwhile, they were searching the other 4, and her best friend so happened to have everyone's paraphernalia and drugs in her purse. They find the following: 2.5 8 balls, half ounces of crystal, 2 grams of heroin, about 3.5 ounces of weed, about 50 perks, a script of Xanax, and a bunch of needles. Meanwhile, the boyfriend starts going into a frenzy and starts freaking out about how the Brotherhood will take care of him when he's away in prison. Needless to say, they all got arrested and were taken to the local police station. So, back to the girl who is ODing in the room. The EMT resuscitates the victim, but she had a very, very low pulse. So she leaves with the paramedics and goes to the hospital. Needless to say, she left with a pulse, but ended up becoming brain dead and was taken off life support. Back to the hotel room, after everyone was taken into custody, and the girl was sent to the hospital, where she later passed, we had to go into the room with some detectives. As soon as you walked into the presidential suite, you looked to the right where the bath was, and it was like something out of a movie. They had 5 chairs in the bathroom all in a circle, with incense still burning, belts, tourniquets and needles everywhere. The bed was still wet, from where the girl's body was laying packed in ice, and on each mirror in the room there was a swastika with the letters AB and white powder and blood everywhere. We also ended up finding 5 copies of Mein Kampf in the room as well. Hands down, one of the creepiest and strangest calls I've ever had whilst working here. Number 7. I want to tell you about someone who was in my life that turned out to be a horrible person. Just to let you know, I'm 23 now, and this started when I was 9 years old. I'm going to start with saying that he never did any of this to me, but I was living in his house at the time it did. So when I was a kid, both my mother and father were alcoholics. They got into physical fights almost every day, and me and my sister, being protective of my mother, we would try to attack Dad when he hurt her, even though I was only 9 and my sister only 14. It never ended well. He beat us too. The cops were always called, until a day he attacked all of us and got arrested for the last time. That's when we met Steve. He was the responding officer to the domestic call. Right off the bat, he and my mum got an attraction, and sooner or later they started dating, even though it was barely a month after my father got arrested. They'd start talking every day, started dating, and had a normal relationship. I thought he was the nicest guy I'd ever met. He'd buy us gifts, take us places, and do anything to make us happy. They dated for about 1.5 years, and then they broke up. I remember not long after, my mum told me something that made my skin crawl. She told me that during the time they were dating, he came over and he said he was going to the washroom. It took him a long time, so my mum went upstairs to see what was going on, and she caught him in my sister's room, sniffing her underpants. She never broke it off, because she was the type of person who always wanted to feel needed, even if it put me and my sister in danger. I blame it on the alcohol. He always tried to stay in me and my mother's life, even though she was dating other men. On June 15th, 2007, when I was 15 years old, my mother passed away. She had a brain aneurysm and was put on life support for 2 days before we could say goodbye. Behold, Steve showed up to the hospital to say goodbye as well. It was very nice of him, but I don't know how he knew. She passed the next day, and since I was in foster care at the time it happened, I was placed in a teen psych ward in the same hospital for 1.5 months on suicide watch. Nobody in my family came to visit, but Steve came every single day. He would take me out if they let me, bought new pool cues and ping pong paddles for all the kids. He was always there. When I got let out of the foster care system, they let me move into his house. Now let me say, this is where it got all messed up. One night, before I got let out, it was my birthday. So, they let me have a weekend visit for 2 days away from the hospital. As a gift, he bought me a brand new Mac laptop and a brand new cell phone, headphones, and all that jazz. I was excited to set everything up over the weekend. I downloaded free music, and back in my day, there was a program called LimeWire. I'm sure most of you remember it. So I went to Steve's computer, since he had the program, to download new music to transfer to my Mac. That's when his history came up. It was all videos of child porn. Videos that were titled 4-year-old tied up and gagged and 3-year-old gangbanged. I freaked out. I knew what it was. And this is where I will get awards for stupidity. I said nothing. I was tired of being placed in foster home after foster home for 5 years, so I said nothing. I was actually scared as hell to move in, I won't lie. I was there for about 5 months, until I went to his computer to download more music. I guess it just slipped my mind at the time. But when I clicked on LimeWire, new videos came up, and I was terrified. He'd never done anything to me, but I started realizing that he was grooming me, buying me thousands of dollars worth of gifts within those months. I'm also going to point out that he retired from the police force after 25 years and was working odd jobs. I had a hospice worker that would come visit me every few weeks since my mum passed, to make sure that I was okay, and I finally let it slip. I told her what I found, and the next day I was taken to a new foster home. Months and months of statements later, he got charged with child pornography. They found hundreds of images and over 100 videos on his computer, and he was sentenced to 9 months. I never spoke to him since, but I've been following the media. A year after he got out, he was arrested again for more pornography and assault with a deadly weapon. Turns out, he sexually assaulted and attacked the nurse who would come in and check on his 87-year-old stepmom, who also lived with us. After the first case came out, another girl came forward to tell her story. He abused her too, back in the 90s. He groomed himself to get close to the mother, then got close with the daughter and abused her. It shook me, because it sounded all too familiar. She said it was because I came forward, that she finally had the courage to stand up and come against him. I feel blessed that I was able to help her come forward. I honestly don't know how much time he got for that, but not long after I searched his name again, he is now suing the police force for being too aggressive with him and tackling him in his driveway, and as he has a bad back. I haven't heard anything since, but to this day I feel blessed that he didn't try anything with me. I don't know if he just thought about it, but I know he's a sick person. His defense in court was, I had the video so that I could try and find the children to help them. Good one. Number 8. I used to work as an armed security guard in a hospital. They referred to us as hospital police, but we were each licensed as security guards. What's creepy here is when I was asked to go to a floor of the building that simply didn't exist. I was guarding the employee entrance when a call came in over the intercom. A fire code on floor 13. Specifically, a suspected fire code, which we used for when the fire wasn't confirmed, but something like smoke, or the smell of it, for example, was present. I was right next to the stairway, so I responded to the call. It turns out that the floor in question doesn't exist. The floor above it and below it exist, but it goes from the 12th to the 14th. If I am correct in remembering, I think they might have even just not built the 13th floor, or not named it the 13th floor. I checked the entire 12th and 14th floor whilst communicating on the radio with the other guards who joined the sweep, and they didn't find squat diddly. No smoke, no smell of smoke, no sign of a fire, and no detectors or sprinklers going off. Someone at dispatch, a new guy, proposed via the radio that the 13th floor might be a maintenance-only sector, but there's nothing between 12 and 14, but a flight of stairs leading between them. I am bewildered at this point, and the other guards are as well. Eventually the search is called off, and the suspected fire code is shut off. When I returned to the dispatch room at the end of the day, to turn in my equipment for the day, one of the more experienced dispatchers informed me that he could not ascertain the origin of the suspected fire code over the intercom. Dispatch didn't issue it, but that he knows the hospital is haunted as hell, and suspected that that had something to do with it. I'm not sure if I believe that kind of stuff though. No one could figure this one out for sure, and our department wrote it off as a malfunction in the warning system after such a confusion. I am still weirded out by the incident to this day. Number 9. Our campus monitor at school told me this story for an interview for the school paper. When he was a few years into his career, he answered a double homicide call. This kid had killed both his parents with a 2x4 on Christmas Day. He went and documented the scene and went back on patrol. Later that night, he sees someone walking down the street that matches the suspect's description. He stops the guy and asks him basic questions and notices some blood on his sleeve and grey shit on his watch. He immediately arrests him and realizes what the grey shit was. The suspect looks up at him straight-faced and goes, "Got that promotion on this one, huh?" One of the most sobering and dark conversations/stories I've ever had with someone. It really makes you look at the world differently. Number 10. Back in my patrol days, I responded to a shots fired call. Through the window, I could see the guy clearly dead in an armchair in the living room. Forced entry, and it was obvious that he shot himself in the head. During the search of the house, in the basement was a blood splatter. It ended at a wall, and the way it got cut off in the wall looked wrong. There was a new dry wall. Our ID team gets in there and breaks the wall. In a 55-gallon trash can is a hole at the bottom, with a pipe that is connected to the sewer line. Inside was red liquid and residue. A DNA swab and samples taken from the rest of the house confirmed that it matched his wife. He had killed her, cut her up, and put her in the trash can, and put in an acidic agent there to eat the flesh and bones. He then built a new wall sealing off that corner of the basement and killed himself. Number 11. As a detective, my partner and I were called out late one night on a 2-year-old who had drowned in the bathtub. There were 6 kids under 9 in the house, and there were 0 adults. We separated the kids and spoke to them individually. The first 2 I spoke to didn't actually know very much. "Mum is gone. We never know when she'll be back. I don't have a dad. I was asleep." Basic stuff like that. I went to get my third kid to interview, and my partner was still talking to his first one, a 5-year-old girl, and my partner is as white as a ghost. The 5-year-old is calm and is acting in a very matter-of-fact way. The 5-year-old said that the 2-year-old wouldn't stop crying. She tried to make him stop crying, but he always started crying again. So she ran a bath, put the toddler in it, and held his head under water until he stopped fighting. Then she got a bowl of dry cereal because she was hungry. Throughout the time that we were there, she continued to display no emotion. Talk about one of those days where you just want to go home and hug your kids. In the end, 2 adults were charged with child neglect, and the state took the kids. The juvenile prosecutor never charged the 5-year-old with a crime, which is a shame, because juvenile court is the best way to ensure that the suspect gets counseling or something. Number 12. I live in a small town, so we don't get much excitement. I'm friends with the local sheriff, so I get all the gossip and even access to crime scenes. Small town, you get the picture. In the first story, there is an elderly couple that lives out in the middle of the woods. So on this dark and unfortunate night, 3 men decide to break into their house in the middle of the night and attempted to rob them. The couple were reluctant and wouldn't give them the combination to the safe, so the men dragged them into the basement. They were then tied to a pole and beaten. The men then dumped gasoline on them and burnt them alive. The smell was repulsive. In a second story, there was a house where a family was murdered around 20 years ago. The house went up for sale afterwards and was bought by an acquaintance of mine. I went over to his house for some sort of get-together. Turns out, he still has the chalk outlines of the bodies in the basement. And in the third story, I was good friends with the son of the old town sheriff. I would go over to his house, and there was one room that was always locked. It was a very large room in the centre of his house, and he would be in there all the time. He didn't let me or his son in there ever. He died of cancer a few years ago, and we went into the room to look inside. Inside there was a large bar. There were fully dressed mannequins everywhere, positioned in ways that made it look like they were all interacting with each other. It was extremely creepy, and to this day, we have no idea why he wouldn't let anyone in. There was nothing malicious about it at all, just extremely strange. Number 13. My father-in-law is a retired police officer. He told me this story about when he was a rookie. He was on patrol and saw a guy fall from a 5-story window. Panicked, he immediately ran over to the body to see if he was okay. When he gets to the guy, who happened to be a 19-year-old kid, the guy stood up with a pretty bad caved-in skull and started growling at my father-in-law, and then immediately fell over. My father-in-law ran over to him and tried to stabilize the kid, and the entire time the kid kept repeating, "Please, don't let me die." Unfortunately, he was unresponsive by the time the paramedics got there, and they called his death at the scene. The freakiest part of the whole thing was when the autopsy came back. They said that from the head injury, they were convinced that he died on impact. My father-in-law still doesn't really understand what happened to this day. My theory was he was still technically alive, but went through some extreme brain damage, or it could have been the body's reaction to the adrenaline. I'm not really sure, but it still gives me the creeps to think about. This happened to my aunt and uncle in the early 80s or so. They were living in Austin, Texas, and had attended a party in a neighboring area. They were driving back very late, and at one point were driving along a very long, completely deserted stretch of road, bordered by woods and brush on either side. There were no houses, no streetlights, and no other cars on the road. Nothing. Until my uncle, who is driving, notices a car coming up behind them, which then speeds up and gets very close. My aunt and uncle start talking about how weird this guy is. They can see it's just one man driving, since there's no reason to tailgate on an empty road in the middle of the night. Then the guy speeds up even more and pulls up alongside them in the other lane. He starts yelling at them to pull over and is flashing what appears to be a police badge. My uncle starts to slow down to pull over, and my aunt absolutely freaks out and tells him not to. She is really creeped out that the guy who is driving the car has no police markings or flashing lights. She pulls up to them out of nowhere and is now trying to tell them to pull over just by flashing a badge. While they argue whether about to pull over or not, the man in the other car is getting more and more angry, yelling at them to pull over, beeping his horn and flashing the badge saying he's the police. My aunt starts crying, and my uncle says fine. If the guy is really a cop, they need to stop for him, and they will stop when they reach the next populated/business area, which will take a while. But they reason that if he really is a cop, he would have had to understand their point of view. My aunt and uncle keep wavering between worried this guy is out of his mind and worried that it's a real cop, and they're going to get into real big trouble for not pulling over when they were told. Finally, they see a gas station up ahead and plan to stop there. As soon as they pull over, the cop speeds off, never to be seen by them again. They didn't think to try and get his license plate number at the time. They were just thoroughly creeped out. They drove home the rest of the way without incident. But it doesn't end there. It gets much worse. A few months later, on the exact same stretch of road, a man is rescued who tells a horrifying story, which is then big news in Austin. The fake cop, flashing a badge and beeping his horn, had gotten this man who was driving at night with his girlfriend on the same road to pull over. Once pulled over, the fake cop forced the man and his girlfriend out of the car and into the woods on the side of the road. He ties the man and his girlfriend to separate trees facing each other and then does horrible things to them both, ultimately killing the woman, while the other is just forced to watch just a few feet away. I'm not sure how the man ended up eventually getting rescued, but it was long after fake cop was gone. Either someone must have found the man tied there, or he finally got loose and found help. They never caught the fake cop/murderer. That could have been my aunt and uncle, if they'd pulled over their car like that in the middle of the night like my uncle wanted to. My aunt always ends this story with, and that's why my husband always has to listen to me. Number 15. I responded for a dead body call, which was called in by a family member. The dispatch team advised that the family didn't lay eyes on the body, but could smell a foul odour, and his car was there, etc. I arrived on the scene and found the dead man in his room. He was on his knees, with a screwdriver sticking out of his arse. The handle end was inserted, with the blade hanging out. After initial pictures were taken, we began to roll him over. He had clothespins on his nipples, and a football mouthguard in his mouth, and it appeared that he had been masturbating whilst his phone was nearby. It was plugged in and powered up, and the first thing that popped into our head was child pornography. I never followed up with what the coroner said, but I believe he had a heart attack. He was a rather large man, and crazy as hell to clean up. Number 16. My friend is a first responder, and here are two stories that happened to him. In the first, two teenage girls get in a wreck and the car is on fire. They're slowly being cooked as they're trapped inside and can't open the windows. The fire team arrives and know if that they break the window, the oxygen gets in and the whole car would go up in a big inferno. And the other option is letting them slowly burn to death. They break the window, hose the car down, but the girls die within a half hour of their injuries. The other story is that a neighbor called in about screams coming from a house. They get into the house and boom, there's a 9-year-old kid lying dead in the living room, blue with eyes bugged out. He had been strangled. They hear screams coming from upstairs and water splashing. They run up, burst into the room, and catch the father trying to drown the younger son. They stop him, luckily, in time. I can't imagine how that kid has gone through life now. Number 17. My best friend received a call from dispatch for a welfare check, and when he got to the home, he of course knew there was no response. He mentioned a pungent smell of death as he stepped foot in the door, knowing damn well this wasn't going to be good. After regrouping himself from the smell, he began to walk down this long hallway where he assumed the smell was coming from. He was halfway down the hall when he noticed blood everywhere in the next room. We are talking floor to ceiling. As he turned the corner into that room, he saw a little ankle biter laying there, chewing on something, and didn't really think much into it. He panned the room, and for a second before he noticed the guy laying in the recliner holding onto a shotgun, pointing at his mouth, the man had literally blown his brains out, had half of his head, and his dog was chewing on a piece of his skull or face. The smell was so awful, due to the fact that the guy was sitting in his house with no AC in the summer for about 3 days. Talk about a fun start to your day. Number 18. I have a detective friend who told me this story of a recent case. A man injected his female co-worker in the neck with a syringe full of ketamine while at gunpoint. They had been on their way to lunch in his car. She fought back and was able to escape before the drugs kicked in. He was captured without incident, and in the trunk of his car was a kill kit, duct tape, rope, hatchet, tarps, the works. Upon investigating his apartment, they discovered that he had gotten rid of all his possessions except for one suitcase and a notebook. The notebook was one long list of names, the first in the list being the female co-worker. He pleaded no contest to 3 felonies and was sentenced to 5 years with a minimum of 3. My friend finished the story by stating, "I know this guy will kill someday." Number 19. I am a contractor for cleaning up dead bodies. My high school psych teacher told a story about how he got a call to clean up a suicide in Louisiana. He shows up to the house with his partner and gears up in a hazmat suit and heads up to the attic where the man had killed himself a week prior via crossbow. Upon entering the room, he was hit with a wave of moist, pungent corpse air, and even through the suit, it made him retch. The guy sat on a box and held the crossbow out in front of himself and pinned himself to a wall with a bolt through the head. As they started removing the crossbow bolt from his severely bloated body, his body exploded into a giant slop, covering them both in week-old Louisiana guts. Needless to say, he chose a different career path. Number 20. This happened a couple of years ago, when I was backpacking in Australia. I travelled around driving a van, like many backpackers do there, as it saves a lot of money with accommodation. I usually slept in rest areas, gas stations, or wherever I could park. This one night, I've been driving for a few hours and started to feel sleepy. I decided then to stop in the next rest area, in the middle of nowhere. Parking in that location during the day could be a great idea, but at night seemed like a horror movie location. There were no cars parked there, but I was really drowsy and had no lights whatsoever. I turned off the engine and closed the curtain to the van. It was not long before dawn that I heard some heavy knocks on the side of the van. "Open up, it's the police." Nothing wakes you up faster than that. My heart was racing. I was adjusting to the adrenaline rush in my system when they repeated the heavy knocking, saying it was the police. My first thought was that I was parked somewhere that I shouldn't be. But then again, I was in the middle of nowhere, and I was in a rest area. Before opening up, with my mind telling me that the situation was all kinds of weird, I decided to slowly go to one of the windows and look through the gap in the curtains. I could clearly see the shape and shadow of a guy standing beside the van. His car wasn't too far, but it didn't have any lights or flashing lights on it. This guy's definitely not a cop. Bringing up the courage, I shouted, "Get away from me! I have a gun and I'm calling the cops on radio." I don't have a radio or a gun, but that seemed to faze him. I saw him get back in his car, and to add to the creepiness, someone came out of the bushes and jumped into the car as well. They left, and a few minutes after that, I turned on my van and drove in the opposite direction they went in. Safe to say, I never slept in another rest area that didn't have at least a couple of people or cars parked in it. I don't know what those people wanted, but with Australia's history of backpacker serial killers, I'm very happy to be here today. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. Huge respect to everyone working in law enforcement, making our community safer. I really hope you all enjoyed the video. I thought it would be fun to throw in some bad cop and fake cop stories too. It would mean the world to me if you would show this video a little bit of love by dropping a like and leaving a comment. Go on, it only takes a few seconds, and it goes a long way. And whilst you're at it, why not consider sharing this video with a friend, or someone who you think will enjoy it. Also, I'm really pleased to announce that I was part of a radio play over on Killer Orange Cat's channel. I'm really happy with my performance personally, and I would love to know what you think. So on screen now you're going to be able to find the link, and of course in the description. please go check it out. Killer Orange Cat is a great talent and an amazing friend. I'd really appreciate it if you'd show his video some love as well, and listen to the players. It took a long time to put everyone's bits together. But anyway, for now guys, I'm going to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.